We've already seen how we can create a dashboard based on the data worksheet that we previously created. Let's now see how we can create a report based on the data worksheet that we created. So let's return to Style Studio again. If you don't have Style Studio open, then from the Windows Start menu, select the Style Intelligence Program group and then click on Style Studio to launch the Style Studio desktop development tool. You'll recall that we already used Style Studio previously to create our data source, the connection to the database, and we also used Style Studio to create the data worksheet that we are now going to use as the data source for the report that we'll create. So in Style Studio, let's create a new report. Click the New button in Style Studio. And in the left panel, select Report. And in the right panel, select Blank Tabular Report. And then click OK. And that opens a new blank report. Now you'll notice that when you're developing reports, Style Studio has a number of different panels. Actually, some of these panels were present even when we were developing a data source and developing a data worksheet. If at any time you need more space for your report design page and you want to close any of the panels, you can do that by pressing the small X at the top of the panel. Every one of these panels has that, so you can, for example, the console panel, if you wish to hide the console panel, you can click the small X at the top right corner of the title bar, and that will close that panel. To reopen a panel, simply go to the Window menu and then select that panel or press the equivalent key sequence, and that will reopen the panel. You can also move panels around by clicking and dragging on the panel header, the panel title bar. So for example, if I want the Explorer panel to appear on the left side rather than the right side, I can simply click and drag on that panel and move it where I want it to go. If I want it to appear in a tabbed interface over these panels, I could drop it like this because I see the tabbed appearance at the top. So now it's placed into a tabbed interface with the other tabs here. If I prefer that it appear at the bottom, below the other panels, I can drop it here, looking for the red outline to indicate where it will be placed. And now that panel is down here at the bottom. And similarly for any of the other panels. So at your leisure, experiment with rearranging the Style Studio interface by dragging panels around, by closing panels, etc. For the meantime, I'll put the Explorer panel back where it was at the top here. And there is one other thing that you can do with panels, and that is to minimize them. So if you do not wish to see the panel open, but you also don't wish to completely close it, what you can do is minimize the panel, and there is a minimize button also at the top right in the title bar for the panel. And if you press that button, then the panel will collapse to simply its label in the left margin, the right margin, or the bottom margin of Style Studio. So here I've minimized the Explorer panel, and now it appears in the right margin of Style Studio. If I hover over the label, the panel will temporarily reopen, and I can do whatever I need to do in that panel, and then when I move the mouse away, the panel again collapses. So that's the concept of a minimized panel. It's there when you want it, and then it collapses when you're finished using it. So that's a nice way to save space. If you want to reestablish the panel permanently, then you hover over the panel label, and then with the panel open, click the Pin button, also in the panel title bar. So once you've clicked Pin, then the panel returns to its fixed position in the interface. So when you're working with reports and you're managing all these different panels in the course of creating a report and modifying a report, if at any point you can't find the panel that you're looking for, either the panel is in a different place than you're looking for it, so make sure you check all around the interface for the panel that you want. The second possibility is that the panel has been minimized. For example, if you're looking for the console panel, perhaps there's some error in the report generation and you want to see what the error report was, right? And you're looking around and you don't see it. You should look in the margins of Style Studio to see if the panel has been collapsed into the margin, has been minimized. And if it is, then you can hover over the label, the name of the panel, to re-expand it and press the Pin button to reestablish the panel in the interface. And then thirdly, again, if you're missing a panel and you don't see it anywhere in the interface and you don't see it minimized in the margin, then the next thing you would check is under the window menu to see whether the panel has been entirely closed and whether you can simply reopen it from the window menu. So those are just some tips to help you find a lost panel. Now let's get on with designing this report. So we've created a new report, and this is a blank report. So let's add a header. A report has a header region, a body region, and a footer region. If you click all the way in the top margin of the report, you'll notice that this selects the header region. If you scroll down to the bottom of the page and you click at the bottom of the page of the report, that selects the footer region, and in between the header and the footer is the body region. And you can add components into any of these three regions independently. If you ever have trouble selecting the header, the body, or the footer, there are also buttons in the toolbar at the top that allow you to select those regions. So for example, if you click on the header button in the toolbar, that will select the header region. Now, although we won't go into it in this example, you can actually set separate headers for different page types. So for example, and you can see this if you click on the arrow next to the header button, you can actually set a header that will only appear on the first page, or a header that only appears on even pages or on odd pages. And additionally, you can set a header that only appears on pages that have certain elements on them. So for example, if you want a special header to appear on pages that contain a table, perhaps a table that runs over several pages, and every page that contains a portion of that table should have a particular header, you can do that by customizing a header and keying that header to the particular element. This is all covered in the documentation, and we won't go into it now, but I just want to bring it to your attention. For now, let's go ahead and simply add a basic report title by dragging a text element into this header region of the report. So click on the Toolbox tab in the left panel. That opens the toolbox of all the different report components that we have at our disposal. And let's find a text element. You'll find it in the output group. And click and drag on that text element and drag it into the header region, and that gives us a new text element in the header region. And then you can start typing, and we're going to enter as the report title, Sample Sales Report. So you can just type that text, Sample Sales Report, and then click away from the text element to enter that text. You'll notice that there is a black triangle that now appears at the end of the text element. The black triangle is the insertion point. That means that when we add another component, the component will be placed at the black triangle. So as we go through the course of designing this report and adding new components and inserting components, it's valuable to keep an eye on that black triangle that tells you where the new components will be placed. But what we want to do now is we want to style this text element, make it look a little bit more like the title that it is supposed to be. So click on the text element to select it, and then from the toolbar we can do all of the styling that we need to do. I'll illustrate how you can set other properties in just a moment, but let's go ahead and make this, we'll change the font to Tahoma. That's a font that I have on my system. If you don't have the Tahoma font on your own system, then simply select some other font that you do have. So here's a Tahoma font. You can be creative and select your own font. Let's make this larger. We'll make it 24 point. So this is large text now, and we'll make it bold and underlined, all by using the toolbar, the buttons on the toolbar, and we'll center it on the page by pressing the center button. So now we have a nice report title, very large and easy to see. I mentioned that there are other ways to set properties for text components as well as for other components, and let me say a word or two about that. You'll notice that there is a report element panel down at the bottom right. Of course, this panel could appear anywhere. You can move the panel to any location in the interface, but by default it appears here. And this also allows us to set properties for the text element, and this element panel is available for all other components also. So whether you're adding text or whether you're adding tables or charts or headers or other elements, you'll always find this properties panel containing properties that you can set. And we could have made the changes that we did from this panel as well. For example, for the font, if you click on the right side of the font property, you can open up a dialog box that will allow you to set the font, and you can see there that the font that we had set, Tahoma Bold 24 point, all those settings are reflected here as well. So this is simply another way to set the properties, and you'll find in this panel a variety of different properties, some of which are not available in the toolbar. So if there are properties that you wish to set and you don't find the property, the desired property in the toolbar, you can always check the property panel at the bottom right. Additionally, there is one other place that you can go to set properties, and that is the properties dialog box. So for any component, not only for text, but for charts and tables and all other components, you can right-click on the component and select properties, and that will open the properties dialog box for that component. And here again, you'll find a set of properties, some of which appear in the toolbar, some of which appear in the report element panel at the bottom right, and some of which may only appear in the properties panel for that component. So in general, when you're looking for properties to set for components, check the toolbar, check the properties panel, and then check the properties dialog box. Okay, let's continue with our report design. The next thing we're going to do is add a footer. So in the footer region of the report, what I would like to do is add page numbering. That's a very common thing to do in a report. I'd like at the bottom of each page to have the report page say, for example, 5 of 30, meaning page 5 of 30 pages. Right? So obviously I can't simply add a static text element here and enter the page numbering, because right now I don't know how long this report is going to be. It could be 30 pages, it could be 300 pages. It depends on the other components that I add. Perhaps I might add just a single chart, in which case the report is 1 page. I might add a very long table, in which case the report might be 1,000 pages. So I need some automatic way to insert the page numbering so that the page numbering is correct regardless of what else I add to this report. And the way we do that is by adding a text element with special codes in the text element. So let's see how this works. Select the footer region at the bottom of the page by clicking on it or by clicking the footer button in the toolbar. Then back to the toolbox panel by clicking on the toolbox tab. And let's drag a text component into the footer region. Drop it there. And now what I'm going to do is begin typing the word page. So I'd like this to say page 5 of 30, for example. Now, how do I insert those numbers? What I do is I use special codes. I use a P in curly braces to insert the current page, and I use an N in curly braces, to insert the total number of pages. So if I want the text in this footer to say page 5 of 30, page 6 of 30, et cetera, and reflect the correct numbering for the report when it's generated, this is what I would do. P in curly braces gives me the current page, N in curly braces gives me the total number of pages, and I can add any additional text that I want. For example, here, the word page, the word of, and you can make this as elaborate as you want. But there is one very important thing to remember when you're inserting page numbering using this method, and that is that this only works in the header or the footer of the report. So when you're using these special codes, P and N, and if you look at the documentation, you'll see there's another special code, D in curly braces, to insert the current date. All of those special codes only work in the header or in the footer of the report. So if you put these special codes in the body of the report, they will not be converted to actual page numbers. Okay, so click away from the text element, and now we've entered that page footer. If you like, you can center that on the page, or you can even right-align that on the page, depending on where you like your page numbering to go. I'll keep it centered on the page. And now we've got a header giving us the title of the report, and we've got a footer giving us the page count of the report. Of course, the footer appears on every page. So at the bottom of every page, we'll have the running page count, and the header appears at the top of every page of the report. Now let's proceed to add a table to this report. There are several ways to add a table. Let me just quickly illustrate a couple of methods, and then we'll proceed with the actual approach that we'll use here. Firstly, you'll notice that in the toolbox there is a table element, a table component, and if you click and drag that into the report, that will give you a blank table. So just a blank table with 4 cells. And what you can then do is you can find a data source in the data source tab in the data source panel. So for example, we might find there's a relational database data source here, the orders data source, that's a sample data source. If we look down further, we'll see that under global worksheet, we can find the worksheet that we created. There's the order data worksheet. You'll also see the Excel order data worksheet. That was the other worksheet that we had created based on imported data. But whatever the case, you can find a data source and you can grab fields from that data source and then drag those fields in various ways into the table. So if I wanted to create a column of the table that was populated by data from the company field, I can drag that company field and I'll drag it above one of the columns so that you'll notice there's a little arrow now above the column indicating that this field will populate the entire column. And if I drop it there, then that will fill that column of the table with the values from the company field. So this is one way to create a table, and obviously you can then proceed to add other fields, and you can insert additional columns by right-clicking and selecting, for example, column, insert column, or append column, and build up a table that way by adding rows and columns, or rather by adding columns, and then by associating fields from a data source with each column. So this is one way to build a table. Let's illustrate another approach. I'm going to delete this table simply by clicking on it to select it and then pressing the delete key on the keyboard. Another way to create a table is simply to drag an entire data source, for example, in this case, the order data worksheet, which contains many fields. I can simply click and drag on that data source, drag that into the report, and that will automatically create a table that contains all of the fields from that data worksheet, from that particular data block in the data worksheet. So that's another approach to creating a table. Now, of course, in general, you would want to create further structure in the table, for example, grouping and summarization, and we don't have any of that right here by using that simple approach. But you can certainly then proceed to create grouping and summarization on these various fields, and we'll examine how you would do that shortly. So those are two different approaches to creating a table. Let's take a look at a third approach. And again, I'm going to delete this one. And so now we're back to where we started with a blank report. The third approach to creating a table is to use the table wizard. So let's return to the Toolbox tab. To use the table wizard, what you do is you click once on the table component. Rather than dragging it into the report, as we did earlier, what we'll do is simply click once on the table component, and that will open the table data binding wizard. And what the data binding wizard does is it walks you through a set of steps that basically allows you to logically structure the table. In other words, to select a data source, to choose columns, to specify a condition if desired, to specify what fields should be used for grouping and summary, and so on. So rather than the graphical approach that we saw just a moment ago, where you drag fields into the various columns of the table, in this approach, the data binding wizard, you're basically specifying the logical structure of the table, and in many cases, this provides an easier way to get started building a table. So you can use the wizard, the data binding wizard, to get started building the table, and then, as we'll see, if you need to make further modifications to the table, you can do that using the other approaches. So let's get started by using the wizard, and again, we'll find the worksheet that we created under the Data tab, expand Global Worksheet, find the Order Data Worksheet, or you can select also the Excel Order Data Worksheet. They should be more or less identical, but I'll use the Order Data Worksheet. Then proceed to the Columns tab, which you can do by clicking the Columns tab or by pressing the Next button at the bottom, and just verify that all of the columns have been selected. In other words, all of the columns in the left panel also appear in the right panel. If for some reason you don't see the same list of columns in the right panel, then just click on a field in the left panel and press the arrow button to add it to the list in the right panel. The set of fields that are listed here on the right are the set of fields that will be displayed in the table. So there will be a column of the table devoted to each of the fields that are listed here. Okay, let's skip the Condition tab. We'll add a condition later, but if you just want to take a look, this condition tab basically allows you to specify a filtering condition using the filtering condition controls that we've already seen previously. You can specify a field and then a filtering operator and so on. We will specify a condition on this table, but not right now. So let's continue on to the Grouping and Summary tab. And here we can specify which fields of the that we've selected, which fields under the Columns tab should be used as grouping fields and which fields should be used as summary fields. So let's at least do some initial setup here. We're going to select the company field as a grouping field. In other words, in this table, I want to see the data grouped by company, so all the records corresponding to a particular company should be grouped together. And to do that, I'm going to click and drag on the company field and drag it over to the grouping panel. You can also click on the field and then press the arrow button, and that will also add it to the grouping panel. And additionally, I want to add a summary field, and that field will be the quantity field. So you can select the quantity field either from the list of query fields or from the list of selected fields, and just click and drag the quantity field and add that to the summary area. And what this means is that in the table that we're constructing, we're going to get data. The data in the quantity field will be summarized for each group. In other words, for each particular company, we're going to end up summing up all the quantities of products sold to that company. And then at the end of the table, we'll also have a grand total that will give us the grand total of quantity across all of the records in the table. Okay, we're going to specify some other grouping later, but not for now. So now we're done with the wizard. And before we leave the wizard by pressing the finish button, it's important to note that the wizard is a one-time tool. In other words, you can use the data binding wizard to do the initial table setup as we're doing, but we won't be able to return to the data binding wizard again. Right? So there's no way, once we've created the table, there's no way to get back to the data binding wizard. So this is really intended just for initial table setup. If you need to make further modifications, there are other ways to do further modifications, such as adding additional grouping and so on, and we'll see that very shortly. So once we're sure we're done with the wizard, we can press the finish button, and that creates this new table in the report. Now you'll notice that the table does not display any actual data. What we're seeing here is metadata, simply a representation of the fields that will appear in the table and the method in which they'll be represented. You can see that there are several different symbols that are used here to help indicate to us how this table is going to be generated. For example, next to the company field, we see this grouping symbol, and next to the, for example, the quantity field, we see the summarization symbol. Right, so we see grouping and summarization symbols next to grouped fields and summarized fields. Next to other fields, we see a down arrow, which means that that particular field, the values in that field are going to expand downwards. So the values in the order date field will expand downward so that we get a column filled with order dates. And likewise for the state and the quantity, etc. If you click on the table, you'll notice that the table has a structure, a well-defined structure. Let's take a moment to look at this structure. Firstly, there is a header band, a header row, and that the elements in this header row, the cells, simply contain static text. The word company, the word state, the word order date, and so on. Then comes the detail row of the table. The detail row of the table contains the actual raw records. In other words, this table is pulling data from the data worksheet, and in the data worksheet, there is a whole list of records, and those records contain value for company, for state, for order date, for quantity, etc., etc. The detail row, when the table is generated, when we generate the report and the report pulls back the actual data, the detail row will expand to as many rows as necessary to display all of those individual records. The Gf1 row stands for Group Footer 1, and that will give us the summary corresponding to the company grouping. So for each company, remember that we specified that we want to group on company, meaning that all the records for a given company will be grouped together. They'll all appear in sequence, one after the other, in the table. And then following that group, there's going to be this Gf1 row, which gives us the summary for that group. And that will include the company name and then the summed quantity for that particular group. So the structure of the table is essentially that there will be a set of detail records followed by the summary for that particular company, then another set of detail records for the next company, followed by the summary for that company, and so on, for as many companies as we have in the data worksheet. And then finally, at the very end of the table, there's a global footer, and that will have simply the word company here, and then the grand total for all of the records that appear in the table. So the GF1, the group footer 1, is repeated again and again, once for each company, and for each company gives us the summed quantities for that company, whereas the global footer gives us the summed quantities for all of the records in the table. So this is the table that we've created so far. Now again, we're not seeing any data here. If we do want to see data, then we have two options. The first option is to preview the report, and we can do that by pressing the preview button in the toolbar. So let's try that. Press preview. And the report will generate, which means that the report will look at the data worksheet, and the data worksheet will in turn execute a query on the database. So the data is returned to the data worksheet, and the report pulls the data from the data worksheet, and this is the result we get. So you can see, firstly, that this is a fairly long table. If you look at the top right corner, you'll notice that there are paging controls there indicating that this table goes on for 95 pages. But let's just point out a couple of the highlights, which are that you'll notice that there is grouping by company, as we specified. So what we're going to see is initially all of the records corresponding to the company AMG Logistics, and that goes on for a few pages. And eventually, if we page down a few pages, you'll notice that we get to the end of the records for AMG Logistics, and then comes that GF1 row, the group footer 1 row, that gives us the aggregated quantity, the summed quantity for that company. And then we begin a set of detail records for the next company, which is Big Ed's BBQ. And this goes on and on. You get a set of detail records for a company, followed by the summary for that company. And then on the very last page, we get the summary for the last company, which is XO Resellers. There's the GF1 row again. And then the global footer, which gives us the grand total across all of the entirety of the rows in the table. So that is the table that we have created so far. Okay, you can leave the preview tab open. Let's return to page 1. You can leave the preview tab open because the preview tab will automatically update when we make further changes to the table. That's because of this setting here, refresh on change. So as long as that option is selected, when we go back and forth between the design tab and the preview tab, the preview will automatically update. That's true in almost all cases, unless you're adding some advanced script to your report, in which case, in some cases, the preview tab does not automatically update and you need to generate a new preview. Okay, let's return to the Design tab. And I mentioned that there is another way to view the actual data other than creating a preview, and that is called Live Edit. Right next to the Preview button in the toolbar, there's a Live Edit button, and what that will do is it will actually populate the design view with data from the data source. So click on that button, and what you'll note is that the report now generates the table, but it does so within the design view, which means that you can actually work in the design view with a table that has data, and we could go on now making modifications with this version of the table, with the actual data in the table. Now, this feature is off by default. The Live Edit view is turned off by default because doing this, populating the design view with data, may, in some cases, actually slow down your design process. If you're dealing with a data source that has a very large amount of data and you're dealing with charts or tables that pull a very large amount of data, then having the design view populated with data may slow down the design process, in which case you simply turn that off and you go back to working with metadata, which is the default. Okay, now let's say that I want to add some additional grouping to this table. For example, let's say that in addition to grouping on company, I want to group the records by order date. In particular, I want to group by quarter. Well, what I can do, since I can't go back to the data binding wizard, I'll have to make whatever changes I want to make right here. And I can do that by right-clicking on the cell, on the order date cell in the detail band, right-click on that cell, and then go down to the cell option and select Group and Quarter. And that will group the order date field by quarter. When you do that, you'll now see that the order date field has the grouping symbol next to it, indicating that this order date field is now grouped, and it's grouped by quarter. Now, additionally, what I'd like to do is, in addition to getting the summed quantity for each company, I would also like to get the summed total for each company. So in this column here, in the total column, I'd like to have the total field also be aggregated. So I want the summed quantity, and then next to it, I want the sum total. I can do that in a couple of ways. Firstly, I can select the desired cell and then specify that I want this cell to be populated by the total field. To do that, I go down to the Properties panel at the bottom, to the Data tab in the Properties panel, and from there I can select the column option and then choose the total field. And that indicates then that this cell should be populated by the values from the total field. And you'll notice that when I do that, it automatically carries along with it an aggregation symbol because it understands that since I've placed this field within a Gf row, within a grouping row, a group footer row, that value should be aggregated. So that's one approach. Again, simply select the cell, and then in the Data tab at the bottom, specify the column that should be used to populate that cell. Another approach, if I delete that, another approach is to simply copy the existing total, right? I have the total field already bound in the detail row in that column. So what I can do is copy and paste that cell. I'll just select copy, and then right-click in the empty cell where I want this to be placed, and select paste. And now, again, I have the total field in the Gf1 row in the total column. Now, what I'd like to do is, in addition to having the quantity and the total aggregated on a company-by-company basis, I'd also like to see the aggregated quantity and total for each quarter. So what I'm going to do is introduce a new grouping footer row, and that will allow me to then to compute the quantity and the total on a quarter-by-quarter basis. So let's add a new row. And to do this, you can click any cell in the Gf1 row, and then right-click, and select Region, Insert Group Footer. And this will insert a new Gf row below the existing Gf row. So now we have another group footer row where we can create another level of aggregation. Now what I'd like here is I'd actually like the order date column to be on the left because I want to see within each quarter the companies within that quarter. So the structure of the table that I'm aiming for here is grouping by quarter, and within each quarter I want to see the list of companies and their sales in that quarter, and then the aggregation for each company, and then at the end of that quarter the aggregations for that quarter. So to make this more coherent, I'm going to move the order date column all the way to the left of the company column. And I can do that by clicking above the column. If you click just above the column, you'll notice that a small arrow is placed, or a small triangle is placed at the top of the column, and that selects the entire column. And then click on that arrow and simply drag the column all the way to the left, so that the order date column now appears all the way at the left of the table, to the left of the company column. So now we have an empty Gf row down at the bottom, or near the bottom, and you'll notice that this one is called Gf1, and the original one is called a Gf2. So these are two different levels of grouping footer. And what I'd like to do is, in this Gf1 row, I want to have the order date, and then I want to have the quantity and the total for that quarter. So again, I'm going to simply copy the existing order date field from here. So right-click, select Copy, Paste, And that adds the order date field now into the Gf1 row, and you can see that it retains its grouping characteristics. So this is still a grouped field now in the grouping footer row. And likewise, I'm going to copy and paste, and this time I'll just use Control-C and Control-V on the keyboard, the quantity and the total. So now I have this additional grouping footer row that will give me the quarter, the grouped order date, and for that quarter, the summed quantity and the sum total. Let's take a look at the preview to see how all this appears at the moment. So you can simply click on the preview tab again, and the table will regenerate. And what you'll notice is that we now have grouping both by date, both by quarter and by company. So here is our first quarter in the data, 2010 first quarter. And then within that quarter, we have several companies. We have Big Ed's BBQ first, and then you'll see the summary row for Big Ed's BBQ, then FMG Consulting, a set of detail records for that company, and then the summary for that company, and continuing on for all of the companies for the first quarter. The report is now 104 pages. And if we page forward another page, we get to the end of that first date group, the end of the first quarter of 2010 date group. And so we have the aggregated quantity and total for that quarter. And then we begin the next quarter, again, with all the companies listed for that particular quarter. Now, what I'd prefer to see here, rather than, if I go back to page 1, rather than having the company name just on the first line, I might prefer to see the company name on each row. Again, this is an aesthetic judgment, but for this example, we'll see how we can get the company name itemized on each detail row. So let's return to the design view, and let's click on the cell that generates those company names. That is this cell over here in the detail row, and go down to the option panel at the bottom and select as detail. So if you select as group, then the company value, the company group label will appear as we saw it, basically just a single time, followed by all of the details for that company. If you prefer to have that value presented as itself as a detail, as part of the detail record, you select as detail, press the apply button, the green apply button in the properties panel, and then let's return to the preview, which will regenerate automatically. And you can see now that the company name is repeated again and again on each detail row. Returning to the design view, let's save the work that we've done so far by pressing the Save button in the toolbar. That opens the Save As dialog box, where you notice that you'll have two choices. You have an opportunity to save local report or repository report. Local report means that you're simply going to navigate through your file system. This is your own, when you select local report, you're looking at your own file system, your own disk drives, your own network drives, etc. And that allows you to save the report somewhere locally. Reports are saved as an SRT file. That's the extension for a report. And so when you save the report, you'll be saving this SRT file. A saved report does not contain any data. So even though this report appears to contain a table with much data, when you save the report, the only thing that is saved is the layout information. In other words, information that specifies that there's a title here, that there's a table here, what fields are supposed to appear in the table, what grouping is in the table, and so on, but not the data. The data is always drawn from the database. So when you save a report, you're not saving any data, you're only saving the layout information of the report, and that actually is the reason that this is called an SRT file. SRT stands for Style Report Template. We call it a template because it does not contain any data. So when you save a report locally, you're just saving the SRT file, which you can then reopen in Style Studio at a later time to continue editing, etc. If you save a repository report, this saves the report into the current working repository. You'll recall from the beginning of the video when we first opened Style Studio, we opened the configuration dialog box for Style Studio where we set the current working repository. So whatever is the current working repository is the location where the report will be saved when you save the report as a repository report. Now, saving a report as a repository report actually does two things. It does save the SRT file, right? Again, the report, a saved report, is an SRT file. So it does save the SRT file, and it additionally makes an entry in the repository listing. The repository listing is the listing that you'll see when you expand the asset panel here and you look at the report repository listing. And it's also the listing that the user of the portal sees when they look at the report repository listing. So we'll explore that in just a moment. But for this example, let's save it as a repository report. We'll give it a name and call it Sample Sales Report. You can also give it an alias, but in this case, we'll just give it a basic name, Sample Sales Report. We'll save it at the root report repository level, so it will be on the same level as these other reports, and then press Save. And you can see that the tab now updates with the report name, and this report has been saved. But as I mentioned, saving a report as a repository report does two things. First of all, it saves the SRT file. So this report SRT file has now been saved. And additionally, it makes an entry in the repository listing. So if we expand the asset panel here, I can do that just by hovering over it because it's a collapsed panel, and then expand the report repository, we'll now see this report listed in the report repository. More than that, if we were to go to the user portal now and click on the report tab of the user portal and expand that report repository listing, we would also see the report listed there, because the user portal, our server, is referencing the very same working repository that Style Studio is using. So if we save this report to the working repository in Style Studio, then it will be visible to our server as well, to the user portal, which is also using the very same repository. And we'll confirm that shortly when we go ahead and preview this report in the portal. Okay, but for now, we have the report saved, and we can go on to make some further modifications to the table. Let's make the table look a little bit better by adding some styling. We'll begin with adding a table style. A table style is global formatting for a table, which is available both in reports and in view sheets and dashboards. So let's right-click on the table and select Properties. You can also double-click on the table to open the Properties dialog box. And in the Table Properties dialog box, click the Select Style button in the Style region. And for the table style, we'll select from the blue group, we'll select Dark Header Borders. Okay, so select the Dark Header Borders style, and then press OK. And then press OK again to apply the style to the table. And you can see that that achieves various formatting goals, such as making the column headers bold and white text against a dark background, and setting some border grid lines between the cells, etc. Okay, let's do some further modifications. What I'd like to do here is move the product field, this product column, to the left of the quantity field. So again, this is simply a job of moving columns, which I can do by selecting the entire column, clicking just above the column header to select the entire column, and then dragging that column to the position where I want it to appear, and the green highlight will indicate to me where the column will be placed. When I see it where I want it, I can just drop the column there, and now the product column is to the left of quantity. Now let's take a look again at the preview to see what else needs to be done here. Click the Preview tab. The table will automatically update. What I might want to do here is, you'll notice that I have, for the date grouping, I have the label of the date group, and then I have all of these empty cells below. Again, this is an aesthetic judgment, but what I would like to do is merge the group label together with these other cells, so I don't have all these dividing lines. What we can do is return to our design view, find the order date group cell, and what I'd like to do is merge that with the cell below. So with the order date cell selected, shift-click also on the Gf2 cell, the cell right below it, and that selects those two cells. Then right-click and select Table Merge Cells. And that will merge those two cells together. Let's take a look at the effect of this in the preview. Again, clicking the Preview tab, you can see that now the date label basically spans across all of the different companies. So it makes it much more clear that all of these records for these different companies, right, the companies are grouped together, but all of these records are for the particular quarter that is shown here. So all of these companies, all of these records are for the first quarter of 2010, and if we go on to additional pages, eventually we'll reach another quarter. Here's the second quarter of 2010, and so on. Now, there's still a number of things that we can do to make this table look more clear, and to do that, we'll go back to the design view. Let's begin by making the date a bit bolder. That's the order date here, because we can make that stand out a bit more. So let's make this larger text. I've already selected that cell, but if you don't have that cell in the table selected, click on that merged order date cell. And let's make that bold and a larger font, perhaps a 12-point font, to make that order date, to make that quarter label stand out. Now let's make the summaries for the order date also stand out. That's this row here, the Gf1 row. So what I'd like to do is select that entire row and set a background for that row. To do that, what I could do is I can shift-click to select multiple cells. Click on the order date cell and then shift-click on the total cell, and that selects all the cells. But an easier approach is simply to click in the left margin just to the left of that row. So in the Gf1 row, you'll notice that if you hover the mouse just to the left of the order date cell, the pointer turns into an arrow, and if you click there, you can select the entire row in one shot. So that's the easiest way to select all of the cells in the row. Once you've done that, go down to the Properties panel at the bottom, click the Format tab, and let's set a background here. Perhaps a light color, perhaps a light gray color. Let's also add some additional explanatory text, which I can put in this cell here, so that when the user looks at this, they know what they're seeing in this row. And so in this cell, this is a blank cell in the company column. If you prefer, you could put it in any of the other blank cells, but I'll put it here. I'll just type quarter total. So that when the user looks at this row, they'll know that these values represent the quarter total for this particular quarter. And I can then merge these cells together, the quarter total text cell and the adjacent cells, again by shift-clicking to select all of them, and then right-click, select Table, Merge Cells. Okay, let's preview the result of this. So return to the preview, and the table is regenerated. And if we scroll, we should be able to find an instance of this band that we just created. Let me return to the first page. Okay, and on the second page, we'll find this band that we just styled. There's the label for the quarter, and this row now says quarter total and the totals. We'll format these cells in a short amount of time, but let's actually make the text in this row a little bit bolder, a little bit more easy to see. We'll make it 11-point bold, for example. So let's return to the design view and simply select, again, this entire row, and we'll just make the entire row 11-point bold. And that makes that row pop out a little bit more, makes it easier for the user to find that total. Let's do a similar thing for the company aggregates. So find the Gf2 row, that's this row, right? That gives us the company summaries for quantity and total. And let's also give that a colored background. So again, I've selected that entire row. And then in the panel at the bottom, in the Format tab, select Background, and we'll give that a blue colored background. So that basically styles that the background of those cells, again, to make it a little bit more visible to the user. Let's also add some text over here in this state column, and this text will say company total. Again, to help the reader of this table understand what totals they're looking at. And as we did in the case of the Gf1 row, we can merge these cells together. So the company total cell that we just entered the text in, and the cell adjacent to it, select the two cells, and then choose Table Merge Cells. And again, we can make this text a bit bolder. So I'm going to select, in fact, let me select the entire row. And again, I'll make this bold 11 point. And we'll see when we look at the preview, if it seems like we have a little bit too much bold going on, then we can always, we can always tune down the intensity of the table by taking some of the bold away. But let's take a look at the preview and see how this looks now. And in fact, that looks fine. That doesn't look like too much bold to me. It just makes it clear what are the detail rows and what are the summary rows. And so now, as I look down this table, I can see the summaries pop out of the table very clearly for each of the different companies. I can see the quantity, the total, and then as I page through the report, eventually I get to the summaries for the quarters, which are the gray rows. Now, there are just a few more things that we'd like to do to wrap up this table. First of all, you'll notice that the column headers are not centered. We can certainly center the column headers. Additionally, we need some formatting on the total values, also on the price values. These should be represented as dollars. Currently, they are not. And also, we might like to force a page break, perhaps after each quarter. So after the total for each quarter, perhaps we should introduce a page break and then start the next quarter on a subsequent page. So let's take care of those final things. Return to the design view, and first let's format the headers so that they're center aligned. And I can do that by selecting the entire header row, again by clicking in the left margin next to that header row, and then selecting the center button in the toolbar, and that will center those headers. And now what I'd like to do is apply formatting for the price and total columns. We don't have any other currency columns here, and the quantity column is an integer value, so we don't really need any additional formatting unless we simply wanted to put commas or something like that. But for the price and the total columns, we should apply a currency format. So select the price and the total cells in the detail row. And then in the panel at the bottom, the format panel, select a number format. And the first format that pops up there is ### 0.00. That's actually very close to the format that we'd like. So I'm simply going to edit this format. I'm going to remove the zeros to the right of the decimal place and remove the decimal point. The reason for that is that all of the values are whole numbers in any case. So adding the decimal places simply complicates the appearance of the table, and we don't need them. And I'm going to put a $sign in front of that decimal format. So basically, this number format will have a $sign, and then it will have a comma every 3 places. Again, for more information about these formats, please check out the documentation. There's more information about how to use these symbols to construct formats. I'll just point out that we could also use a currency format because these are currency values, but the currency format would have digits to the right of the decimal place, and I'm trying to avoid that to maintain the clarity of the table, so that's why I'm using a number format rather than a currency format. Also, it's worth noting that the currency format will adapt to the locale in which the report is being used. So the currency format, when you specify a currency format, that will not always be represented in terms of dollars. It might be represented in pounds or yen or euros, depending on the locale in which the report is being used. By using a number format, you can ensure that the currency symbol that you specify, here dollars, will always be used regardless of the locale in which the report is being used. So again, we'll specify this number format, press the apply button, and now we've formatted those cells. But we should keep in mind that there are additional cells that are representing currency values, and those are the total values in the GF2 and the GF1 row. So I want to format those as well. So select those two totals, the total aggregated totals in the GF2 and the GF1 row, and then repeat the process, specify a number format, and use the same number format that we used previously. Again, $###0, press apply. And all those values, all those dollar amounts will now be appropriately formatted. Okay, let's delete the global footer. You'll note that if we go to the very last page of the report, there is a global footer here. It gives us the grand total for the quantity, right? I never took the time to actually add the total field there as well. The reason being that I don't really want that grand total in the table at all, so I'm simply going to remove that global footer. We can do that by clicking any cell in that row, right-clicking, and selecting row and delete row. And that will remove that global footer row. Finally, we said that we'd like to force a page break after the Gf1 row. The Gf1 row is the footer row corresponding to the total. So click on any cell in that Gf1 row, and then go down to the Option tab in the Properties panel at the bottom, and select New Page After. And then press Apply. Okay, and what that should do is it should force a page break following each instance of the Gf1 row, which is each instance of the quarterly totals. Well, let's take a look at the preview and see if that's the case. So I'm going to make sure that I'm at page 1 of the preview, and you can see that we have here 2010 first quarter and all of the data for all the different companies in that quarter. And I'm going to page forward, and this is still that first quarter. But then when I get to page 3, I get the total for that first quarter, along with the total for the last of the companies in that quarter. So here's the quarterly total, and then I get a page break. And then the next quarter's data will begin on the next page. Okay, let's save the work that we've done by pressing the Save button in the toolbar, and this report is again saved into the repository. And we're basically done now with the structure and the formatting of the table. And the next thing that we're going to do is apply some filtering to the table. Let's go ahead now and add a filtering condition to this table so that we can restrict the records displayed in the table based on certain conditions. Now, the conditions that we want to specify are a particular date range, in other words, a starting date and an ending date, and we also want to restrict the set of companies that are displayed in the table. But we don't want to make these filtering selections as the designer, but rather we want to allow the end user to be able to specify the date range and the set of companies. So what we really need here is a parameterized condition. We need a filtering condition that includes parameters that the user of the report will be able to set when the report is generated. So let's see how we would do that. Go ahead and right-click on the table and select the condition option. It's towards the bottom of the context menu. That opens the condition dialog box. You'll recall that we also had the ability to set conditions when we were using the data binding wizard for the table. And this is the very same feature over here. So we could have set a condition at the time that we were using the data binding wizard for the table, and we can also set a condition afterwards, which is what we're doing now. So for the beginning part of this condition, let's first find the order date field. We want to set a condition on the order date that the range of dates in the table should be between some start and some end date that the user specifies. So from the third menu here, I'm going to select between. We want the order date to be restricted to a set of dates between some start date and end date. Now you'll note that you can click on the small pop-up here to select a fixed start date and a fixed end date, but that's not what we want to do. We want the user to be able to select that date, start date and end date. So what we'll do in that case is from the second pop-up, the rightmost pop-up here, select instead of value, select variable. And likewise for the end date, select instead of value, variable. And what this allows us to do is to enter the name of a parameter, both for the start date and for the end date, rather than the value. And what will happen then is that the user will be prompted to supply the value of that variable. For the start date parameter, we can give this variable the name start date. pay attention to the way that you spell it, because we'll have to remember the spelling later. I spelled it with a small lowercase s, capital D, start date, and we'll create a parameter name, a variable name for the end date, and simply call that end date with a lowercase e and a capital D. You can use whatever spelling you want. These labels, these variable names are arbitrary, but as I mentioned, commit to memory the spelling that you use, because we'll have to be aware of the spelling later on when we set another condition on the chart that we'll add later. So we have two variables here, start date and end date, and I can now press the append button, and that appends this condition clause to the condition that we're building. And so this table will now be filtered so that the only dates displayed in the table will be dates in a range between a start date and an end date that the user will specify when they run this report. So that's how you specify a parameterized condition. But we're not done with this condition yet, because we also want to restrict the set of companies that are displayed. And so I'm going to proceed and now create the second part of the condition, which is that the company is one of, so select one of from the third menu, company is one of. And now what I could do is I could press the browse button, which is the button that has a magnifying glass on it, and I could begin selecting a set of companies if I wanted a fixed set of companies in the condition. But again, I don't want to select the set of companies now. I want the user of the report to be able to choose their own set of companies. So instead what I'll do is, again, select from the rightmost pop-up menu, select the variable option, and then we can type the name of a variable that will contain the user choice. And I'll call this variable companies. Again, the name is arbitrary. We're simply creating the name for a variable that will hold the user's choice. So the condition is company is going to be one of a set of companies that the user will select. And there's an option here, use selection list. I'm going to turn that on so that rather than asking the user to type in a set of companies, we're going to prompt the user with a list of companies taken from the company field, and the user will simply be able to select those from a list. Once you've made those settings, then press the Insert button, and that will add this new clause to the condition. So the completed condition now contains two clauses that are joined by an AND operator, a conjunction operator. And the condition reads, company is one of a set of companies that the user will supply, and order date is between some start date and end date that the user will supply. So we're done with the condition, press OK. And we can go ahead and do a fresh preview of this report. Let's save what we've done. And I'm going to close the existing preview. And I'm going to now preview the report because I want to see the effect of this parameterized condition. So press the preview button. And what you'll notice is that now when you preview the report, you're going to be prompted for the parameters in the condition. And the parameters include a set of companies and a start date and end date. So let's proceed through this as if we were the user. I'll select, let's say, the first three companies by shift-clicking. And I'll select a start date and an end date. I'll just choose perhaps January 2012. January 1st, 2012 for the start date, and I guess December 2012 for the end date. So I'm just picking off December 31st, 2012 for the end date. So I'm basically picking off the year of 2012. So I've made some selections, press OK, and now the report will be generated with the filtering condition in effect. And you can see that the report is a good deal shorter, and it begins in the first quarter of 2012, and I have a set of companies, only the companies that I've selected, so it's a smaller set of companies, and then I have second quarter 2012, third quarter 2012, I have a few more companies, and so on. And so basically I have only the year of 2012 and only the set of companies that I selected. So that's how a parameterized filtering condition works. Now we can make some adjustments to that. I'll close the preview. We can make some adjustments to that, for example, the order in which the parameters are prompted and the spelling of the parameter labels. And to make any of these kinds of changes to parameters, what we'll do is we'll go up to the Report menu, back in the Design view, and select the parameter option. Now, the first time you select that parameter option from the menu, you get a little descriptive dialog box here, which you can read at your leisure, but I'll simply dismiss that, and that opens up the parameter definition dialog box. And this is essentially your central headquarters for modifying parameters that exist in the report, and that includes filtering parameters, such as the ones that we have here in a parameterized condition, as well as any other parameters that you define in the report. In fact, you can create new parameters from here as well, if you need to, for example, add additional parameters that will acquire some other user input, perhaps parameters that you intend to use in script, and so on. But you can see the three parameters that we defined in our condition. They're shown in italics because they have been defined within a condition. They have not been defined here in this dialog box. And we can make various changes to these parameters. For example, let's say that we want the company's parameter to be prompted last, after the other two parameters. In other words, in the parameter prompt that the user sees, we want the start date and end date parameters to be listed first, and then the company's parameter. So what I can do is simply move the company's parameter down to the bottom of the list by clicking the little arrow button here, and now the start date and end date will be prompted above the company's parameter. We can also change the labels, so let's make some slight changes here. You'll notice that if you click on the start date parameter, the label, in other words, the label that's shown to the user when the prompt is displayed, is simply the same name as the variable. That doesn't look so great, so let's change this to be something a little bit more presentable, such as starting date. And we can add a colon at the end. So starting date and a colon will be the label of that parameter when the user is prompted. And likewise for end date, we can change this to ending date with a colon. And also for companies, we can change this to companies with a colon. Okay, so we've made some slight modifications. Obviously, there are other settings that you can make here. The documentation explains what these are, and we're not going to go into them now, except to say that if you have certain parameters that you do not want to prompt the user for, and an instance where you would have that is, for example, if the parameter values are being set in script, or perhaps by a drill down report or other mechanism, you can turn the prompting off from here. So for any given parameter, if you deselect prompt user, then the user will not be prompted for that parameter, and in that case the parameter will not have a value. It will have a null value, and the behavior of that will depend on exactly what you're doing with the parameter. But in the case of parameterized conditions, if a parameter does not get a value, then essentially that part of the condition will be dropped. So if we do not provide a parameter value for, let's say, the company's parameter, then that part of the condition will be ignored because it can't be applied. Okay, in this case, we will prompt the user for all of these parameters. So let's go ahead and press the OK button, save the report again, and let's preview the report once more. Press the preview button, and now you can see that the company's parameter is prompted below the starting and ending date parameters, and you can see that the labels here have been updated to reflect the labels that we set in the parameter definition dialog box, and this looks a little bit more presentable to the user. So again, we can make our own choice of date range and company list. I'll just select the same settings that I did previously, and the first three companies, and functionally it should be the same as before, except that the prompt now looks slightly more appealing. Okay, so now we're done with the table, and we can move on to adding a chart. I'll just make one note, which is that the parameter prompting that we're seeing here is the default parameter prompting. In other words, we have not designed this, the parameter prompt we did not design ourselves. This is being generated automatically, simply based on the parameters that we have created in the report. You can, in fact, create your own custom parameter prompting. So if you want to create a parameter prompt that perhaps has an image background and some additional text, some explanatory text, and so on, and if you need more elaborate parameter flows, in other words, if you need to, for some reason, force the user first to select the date and only then to select the companies, or if you want to make the ending date contingent somehow on the starting date and so on, these more elaborate parameter logic, you can do all that by creating a parameter sheet, which is explained in the documentation. Okay, so let's cancel out of here, and now we can move on to adding a chart. Okay, let's go ahead and add a chart to this report. We want to add the chart right above the table, and to do that, I'm going to put the insertion point above the table. The easiest way to do that is simply to click on the table once, and you'll note that the black triangle, the insertion point, is now placed above the table. So even though the table is currently selected, when we add a chart, because the insertion point is above the table, the chart will be placed above the table. So now that we've got the insertion point where we want it, click on the Toolbox tab to open the toolbox, and then click on the chart component. You can also click and drag the chart component into the report, but since the insertion point is already above the table, it's easiest just to click on the chart, and that will place a new chart right above the table. Now, to edit the chart, click on the chart, and you'll note that when you do that, the chart editor opens in the left panel. The chart editor for a report is the same as the chart editor for a dashboard, so some of the concepts that we learned when we were building the dashboard, and in particular the chart on the dashboard that we made, will apply here as well. So the editor should be familiar from what we saw earlier. I can resize this a bit to make sure that I can see all of the tools in the editor. In particular, I'm trying to make sure that I can see all of the fields in the bottom panels here. Okay, let's go ahead and begin setting up this chart. On the x-axis, the horizontal axis, we're going to have the order date grouped by quarter, similar to what we did before in the dashboard. So I'm going to, from our data source, the order data worksheet, I'm going to find the order date field. If you don't see the order data worksheet, then you may need to expand the global worksheet node, and then expand the order data worksheet, and then find the order date field and drag that field onto the x axis, into the x region of the chart in the editor. Drop it there, and that will place the date field on the x-axis of the chart. Now, there are two things to note here. First of all, by default, date grouping is by year, so we'll have to change that. And also keep in mind that the report currently is displaying only metadata, so don't be alarmed when the data doesn't look quite right on the chart. In fact, it won't look quite right because the data that we're seeing on the chart is not actual data. It's simply a representation of the data. In order to see the actual data, we'll need to preview the report or switch the report to live edit mode. And we'll do that in just a moment. Okay, let's address the grouping for the dates. And we do that the same way that we did previously when we were designing a dashboard. Next to the order date field on the x-axis, press the Edit Dimension button. That's the little calculator button. And we can simply switch the level from year to quarter. It's the level property. Switch it to quarter, press the Apply button, and now you can see even in metadata view that the grouping has switched to quarter-based grouping. On the y-axis of the chart, the vertical axis, let's place the total field. So grab the total field from the data source. You'll notice, by the way, that once we've associated the chart with a particular data source, only that data source is visible in the Data Source tab by default. However, if for some reason you want to see other data sources, in other words, say you want to switch the data source for the chart, you can press the Show All button, and that will then expand the list to show all of the data sources. But you have to keep in mind that when you're setting up a chart, the chart can only pull data from a single data source. So in most cases, it's useful just to show the one data source that you're using for the chart. So let's grab the total field and drag that onto the Y region. And now we have sum total on the y-axis of the chart. Again, these are not the real values. This is simply a representation of the data. If we want to see the actual data, we can go ahead and switch this to live edit view, or of course do a preview. So let's take a look at a preview of this report. Press the preview button up at the top. And you'll notice that when we do that, we're going to be prompted to enter the parameters that we've specified previously. Remember that these parameters only affect the table, because these parameters are used in the filtering condition on the table. So these parameters have no effect on the chart. And so I'm not even going to bother making any selections at the present time. By leaving these blank, what I'll be doing is basically passing a null value into these parameters, and that means that the condition on the table will be dropped, will be ignored, and we'll see all of the data in the table. So I can ignore the parameters simply by pressing OK, and then the preview will generate. You can see that the data in the table is basically all of the data, and the report goes on for 128 pages. That's all fine. What I'm really interested in is just to verify the data on the chart, and you can see that the chart is now giving me the sum total quarter by quarter from the beginning of the data set in 2010 until the most recent data in the fourth quarter of 2013. Okay, let's go back to the design view and make some additional changes to the chart. What I'd like to do here is I'd like to change the chart into a stacked bar chart. And again, the procedure for doing this is the same as when we were creating a chart in a dashboard. Look for the Select Chart Style button. That's this one here in the binding panel. Select Chart Style, press that. Select the bar type chart in the second from left in the top row, and then select the stack option. Press Apply, and that will convert the chart into a stack bar chart. Now, if we were to preview this, you'll notice again that because we haven't defined any additional grouping, this stack bar chart does not appear any different than a normal bar chart. But what we'll do is we'll use the state field as an additional grouping field, and we'll distinguish the different groups, the different states, by color. And then those different colors will comprise the stacking in the bar chart. So let's return to the design view and find the state field. And in order to distinguish the different states by color, we'll drag the state field all the way down to the color region in the visual panel. And this means that different colors will be used to distinguish the different values in the state field. And we can verify that again by pressing the preview tab to refresh the preview. And now we have in the chart the different states distinguished by different colors, and the legend provides the key to understanding which color is representing which state. Let's make one further change to this chart. What I'd like to do is when the user views this report in the portal, I would additionally like the user to be able to distinguish different companies' data in the chart. In other words, I'd like the user to be able to point at different groups on the chart, and I want the tooltip that the user sees to inform the user what company's data they're currently pointing at. Now, the way we can do that is by returning to the design view, and by using this area here, which is called break by or tooltip. If we add the dimension here, that group will then be distinguished by tooltips. So let's take a look at this. What I want to do is I want to find the company field, and I want to drag that down to this break by / tooltip area. Now, in order to see the effect of this, we're going to need to view the report in the portal. So let's do that just for a moment so that we can see the effect of this tooltip region. Let's save the report. The report is now saved to the repository. And again, since the working repository for Style Studio is the same repository that's being used by our server, what we can do is we can go to the user portal, load up this report, and look at the effect of all of the settings that we made for the chart. So I'm going to transition now back to the user portal. And under the Report tab, load up the Report tab, and click on the Sample Sales Report. That's the report that we're designing. Again, the server is able to see that report because when we are creating that report in Style Studio, we're saving it into the current working repository of Style Studio, which is the very same repository location that the server is looking in to load up these reports. So here it is. We can click on it. The report loads up. And the first thing that we see is the parameter prompting screen. You'll notice that in the portal, the parameter prompt looks slightly different than it does in Style Studio. In Style Studio, it's essentially a modal dialog box, but in the portal, what you see is an HTML page, an HTML form. Functionally, it's the same. So let's go ahead and we can actually specify a date range here. I'll do the same date range that I've done before, January 1st, 2012 to December 31st, 2012, not worrying about the time. And I'll select a set of companies here, just the first 5 or so companies by shift-clicking. Press OK. And now the report will load up. Of course, those parameters are only being used to filter the table, will not affect the chart in any way. And so you can see now the chart is broken out by state. Different colors are different states. And additionally, the different states are broken into companies. So I can point at any subgroup on any of the bars of the chart. For example, if I point at this group, you'll notice that the tooltip tells me what company I'm looking at. So this particular segment, this particular subsection of the state of New York represents the company FISCA group, whereas this subsection of the company of the state New York represents high society investments and so on. So that is the effect of dragging the company field to the breakdown by tooltip region of the chart editor. We get a further breakdown that gives us the different a tooltip that indicates the different companies. Now, you can see that this chart is fairly busy, but what we're going to do is we're going to apply the same filtering condition that we currently have on the table to the chart as well. So ultimately, when the user views this report, they're not going to be looking at the report for all of the companies. What they'll be looking at is simply the set of companies that they've selected from the parameter prompt. Just as in the table, they'll make a selection of a set of companies, so too in the chart, they'll be looking only at a subset of the companies, and so the chart will ultimately be much more simple and much more readable. Okay, let's return to Style Studio then. And let's add the same condition to the chart that we previously added to the table. So what we'll do is follow the same procedure. Right-click on the chart, select Condition from the context menu, and we're going to specify the same condition. In fact, we're going to use the same parameter names. And the reason that we'll do that is we want the user to enter these parameters only once. We don't want the user to have to enter one set of parameters for the chart and another set of parameters for the table. What we want is for the user to enter just one group of 3 parameters, start date, end date, and companies, and we want then the conditions to be applied based on those parameters on both the chart and the table. So we're literally going to recreate the same condition that we did before. Order date is between, and then from the rightmost pop-up menu, select variable for both the start date and the end date, and we're going to use the very same variable names that we used before for the table condition. And this is why it's important, why I mentioned before that I wanted you to keep in mind the exact spelling of these variable names, start date and end date. Of course, you have to spell them the way that you spelled them previously in the condition for the table. But I'm being very careful when I write these that I'm using the same spelling as I did before, start date with a lowercase s and a capital D, end date with a lowercase e and a capital D, and then append that condition. And then the second part of the condition is company is one of, and again, I'm going to set this to the variable option and enter the name of the parameter companies, which is the very same name that I used previously for the condition on the table. And I'll select the Use Selection List option, again, just like I did for the table. And then press Insert to add that clause to the condition. So this is the very same condition that we wrote previously on the table, company, and that we're now placing on the chart as well. Company is one of a set of companies which will be supplied by the user and stored in a variable called companies. And simultaneously, order date is between a start date and an end date, which are supplied by the user and stored in variable start date and variable end date. Now, the reason, again, that I'm being very careful to spell these variable names identically to the way that I spelled them before is that I only want the user to be prompted once for the list of companies, prompted once for the start date, and once for the end date. What you'll discover is that if you make a variation in the spelling, then the user will be prompted independently for each differently spelled variable. So for example, if you make a slight typo here and create a variable called company, just like this. Even though this is a perfectly valid variable name, what will happen then is that the user will be prompted once to enter a value for the variable company, and once to enter a value for the variable companies, and that would certainly pose an unfortunate usability situation on the user. So let's make sure that we prompt the user only once for the list of companies, and we'll keep the spelling that way. Let's go ahead and press, once you've got the condition all set up like that, press OK. And now we have the very same condition on the table and on the chart. So let's go ahead and we'll do a fresh preview. I'm going to close the existing preview. Let's save the report by pressing the Save button in the toolbar. And let's do a fresh preview. And you'll notice that we're being prompted only once for each of the parameters. Right? If when you do this, if you see multiple prompts for the same parameter, for example, if you see 2 prompts for companies or 2 prompts for ending date, what that indicates is that you've made a slight misspelling in one of the parameter names, and the parameter names that you've used for the table and for the chart are not identical. So go back to your conditions then and verify that the parameter names are identical in the condition for the table and for the chart. Okay, so let's test this out. Again, I'll make my favorite selection of 2012, January 1st to 2012, December 31st. And again, select a few companies. I'll just select 4 of the first companies. Press OK. And what we should see then is that both the table and the chart have been filtered for the date range that we specified. You can see that the chart, as well as the table, now runs only from through the 4 quarters of 2012 because of the date range that I specified. And the chart is much simpler because the chart is only displaying data from the several companies, those first 4 companies that I selected, which happen to be Big Ed's BBQ, Big Mart Food Stores, Computer Tech, and one other company. Okay, so now we have filtering implemented both on the table and in the chart. So let's go ahead and view this completed report in the portal once more. If you haven't saved it recently, go back to the Design tab, make sure that the report is saved, and then let's go back to the portal. And let's reload this report again, simply by clicking on it in the repository listing. The report will reload. And again, we're prompted to enter some parameters. Let's do that. Again, I'm just using the same date range that we've used before. So the entirety of 2012, and I'll select 4 companies, the first 4 companies. Of course, you can select any other subset of companies that you wish, and press OK. The report loads. And what you'll see now is that we've got filtering on both the table and the chart. And because we've specified that the company field should be associated with the tooltips, even though the chart is breaking out the date on the x-axis and the state by color, I can still get information about the particular company by pointing at the group on the chart. For example, this group here, this is for the 3rd quarter of 2012. It gives me the sum total, the total amount of this particular group, and it tells me that this particular group represents Big Mart food stores in the state of Texas. So that concludes this example of creating a report based on a data worksheet. And that also concludes the evaluation guide video. We hope it was useful to you, and thanks for watching.